Welcome to the BWI Live Show Wednesday, August 7th. I'm Greg Pickel. That is Thomas Frank Carr. T-Frank, I almost forgot I was hosting this show, but we are off and running, buddy. Preseason camp is off and running. The Nittany Lions in week 2 of preseason camp. Pads are on, T-Frank. We saw a bit of what is in store for the Nittany Lions in 2024 back at Media Day on Saturday. We'll have a chance to see them again later this week. Before we get into our full rundown here on the Blue White Illustrated Wednesday live show, I'm just curious your initial impressions on what you saw so far. We've had 2 practice viewing windows. I think it's important to remember James Franklin has said it at Big Ten Media Days. He has also said it at Media Day, local Media Day at Beaver Stadium, that if you're looking for immediate insight on the position battles that are the most important ones and everything else, the 5th practice and the second one with pads, or we saw the 3rd practice and the first one with pads. Yeah. And, and we'll get into the BTN guys. They saw the 5th and what would have been the 3rd in pads. Not necessarily the most appropriate time to draw overarching conclusions, but just your initial impressions from what you've seen so far in camp.
Yeah, and we're going to get into this kind of throughout the show, but they're going to run the ball a lot. So the way they structure practice, I always find interesting because it gives you an insight not into the full picture, but I guess to me what's important. And so this is a little bit of review from the spring, but also what we've seen so far in camp is that they focus on a lot of those foundational, fundamental things within Andy Kotelnicki's offense. So option plays, ball handling, different parts of the run game that then set up the passing game. So before, we would see the quarterbacks work on passing drills and reads and making sure they're layering the football and kind of more quarterback-centric things. We talked about this on the show. We haven't seen them throw the football a whole lot because what they've been doing in front of us is all of those things that lead to play-action passes. And in this particular offense, we're going to get to this at the end of the show, how Andy Kotelnicki's offense played against West Virginia, some of the run concepts that blur into passing concepts and how that creates problems for the defense. That's all important. So they're focusing on that to start. I don't know what they work on after that, right? Like that's the whole thing is we don't know exactly how practice is stacked, but it is different than it was previously. So I do think that gives you an insight to what's important. And this offense, while I don't think it's going to be basic from run the ball, pass, it is going to be built off the run game, and the foundation and the concepts there and making sure that those are sound is super important to the whole thing working. And that is, I think, really important to this. And we've seen that pretty consistently in spring and then in the 2 options we had to see on Wednesday and Saturday of last week.
Yeah, there's no doubt about it. And considering Penn State goes into the 2024 season with 2 of college football's best running backs, preseason Doak Walker Award candidates, Nicholas Singleton and Katron Allen, it makes total sense for Andy Kotelnicki to want to scheme his offense around those guys and what Penn State can do well on the ground. That was part of what the Big Ten Network cast, T-Frank, talked about during its visit to State College, which if you did not see it, we did a recap of Tuesday night's Big Ten Network Penn State preseason camp stops. You can check that out. Lions Den members can check out Nate Bauer's running thoughts from the episode inside the Lions Den forum. And then there's also replays of this multiple times, pretty much over the next 2 days. Today's being August 7th and then tomorrow, August 8th. There's numerous times Big Ten Network is going to re-air that. So if you want to check it out, it was a full 60-minute episode. Pretty good. If you watched last year's, it was a little bit of each team and then a lot of filler stuff. And this year they went back to the old format, focusing a full 60 minutes on one program. So that was cool. Kudos to BTN for that. T-Frank, I know you saw a little bit of it. I was able to catch it last night and then again this morning. But the overarching theme of what the BTN guys thought, and it came up with James Franklin, it came up with Tom Allen. It's come up here on the BWI Live and YouTube channel and podcast feed over and over this offseason is this idea of physicality and Penn State wanting to be its best when it matters most, wanting to be tough when the going gets tough, wanting to be a team that can push you around, can bully you. Abdul Carter, by the way, asked by Howard Griffith what his nickname is. He initially seemed like he didn't have one, and then he went with Big Ten Bully, which seems to fit perfectly this mindset that James Franklin and his staff are trying to implement this summer. And James Franklin said during his sit-down with BTN that he feels like they're getting closer to being that team. What that ultimately means, time will tell. But T. Frank, certainly I think looking back over the offseason and now the preseason, clearly this is a focus for Penn State. It should be, obviously, but it's something that is top of mind from the top of the program on down.
Yeah, so I don't like to correct people here on camera or anywhere, really. Like, I'm like Drew Aller. I don't want to have the hard conversations. I didn't watch the BTN show because I'm a millennial. I don't have cable, so I haven't had a chance to watch it. So I use Nate Bauer's Running Thoughts just like you should at BlueWhiteIllustrated.com, which you can subscribe right now, 2 months for $1. If you're like me and you're like, maybe I'd watch 60 minutes of that. Maybe it'll hit YouTube eventually. You can get that information right now from Nate, who is also fact-checking it as to what we know about Penn State football in that thread, and then you can get Greg's thoughts. PSU1 is the promo code, 2 months for $1. Please use that to sign up right now. I want to get you in the building so that you're in here for Penn State football season. But that physicality comment, it resonated with me because this is something James Franklin talked about. I believe it was either this summer or at the end of spring practice, where this is an intentional change. They have always tried to be strategic about when to be physical because it creates wear and tear. And you want to have the healthiest team possible heading into a football season. And he said, I believe the direct quote was, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over again, where he talked about, we decided we wanted to be more physical, so we're more physical. That led to some bumps and bruises in training camp in the spring, where, according to Franklin, the conversation was had with the players of, hey, can we back off of this schedule? And Franklin had the conversation with them of, we're trying to do something intentional here to become a more physical team, and building that throughout the season. We'll see if that pays off, Greg. I'm always interested in this particular conversation from the angle of, I've always assumed toughness and physicality were prerequisites to play football. Maybe not for every position, but if you're not a tough offensive lineman, I understand you may be big, you may be athletic, but you can't really play football without being a certain level of tough. So the whole conversation to me has always been kind of how do you define these things? Well, I think we're going to see at least a very real case study of Penn State switching things up and being more intentionally physical, and seeing if that process-related approach yields results. And I guess that's the thing, is like, you can just be mean and you can be a guy who is out there trying to hurt people, and that's not intentional physicality, right? So that's not necessarily what we're talking about. We're talking about finishing through the whistle, being strong through contact, always having that mental edge to get in the running game, the passing game, whatever part of the game it is, and dictate the terms to the other player, not just liking big hits or things like that. To me, the intentional physicality shows up differently than that.
Yeah, Yogi Roth, who's new to Big Ten Network staff this year, previously PA guy, played at Pitt, coached at USC, was involved in the Elite 11, was a Pac-12 network analyst, now with the Big Ten Network, called it an entirely physical practice, and just was very impressed by what Penn State did. Said they did so in a smart way, so we'll see how that pays out. You're right. It plays out. You're right, T. Frank. How is it defined? It's defined by winning, right? That's
right.
Really what it comes down to at the end of the day. If the things you change work, then they were genius. And if they don't work, if you don't win, then the things you changed were not genius. No matter, regardless of whether they were a part of the reasons why you won or lost or not, of course, that's how they're ultimately, in most circles, going to be judged. We always try and take you beyond that here at BlueWhiteIllustrated.com. So, just a couple other things from the BTN preseason camp show that stuck out to me. Jerry DiNardo, longtime coach, of course, worried about the offensive line. Totally get it. Penn State replacing 3 starters. Think they'll be okay there. One thing, and this is jumping ahead a little bit to a segment later in the show today, but, Drew Shelton back, ready to go. With talk to him at Penn State Media Day. All systems are go there. So if you found yourself concerned about that, no real reason to be. And then just a final thought here, obviously, I can't believe we went almost 10 minutes into this show, T. Frank, and didn't talk about the receivers. Shame on us. But, the BTN group obviously questioning, just as everybody else has, all offseason, is the Penn State receivers room ready to come through when Penn State needs them to. And I thought this quote was interesting, T. Frank, and I want to get your thought from it. This comes from Yogi Roth. He was asked they were going down the line of analysts talking about their big takeaway of the day. And he said, I call it the circle guy. If you're calling a game, who am I going to circle on a got to have it down? I don't know who that's going to be, because if I'm playing this team as a defensive coordinator, I'm adding another guy to the box, and I'm not letting these backs beat me or this tight end. And so I think that probably, in a nutshell, sums up the preseason outlook for this Penn State offense from a national and intra-conference perspective in 2024. And you can't argue the point.
No, and so we have internally this conversation of people who, and I say internally meaning Penn State football fans and beat writers who are here every day talking about this team, and it's pretty clear that the one guy you have to circle on the Penn State offense from the receiver position that hasn't proven it yet is Trey Wallace. And I guess that's one of the things, like, I was toying around what we're going to talk about on the show today, and like things that have stuck out to me at camp so far. Trey Wallace does look different than the rest of the receivers. He does physically look different. He moves different. He's got the composite skill set you're looking for to be a guy that you have to circle on third down, especially if what Yogi Roth is saying is true and you just add another safety to the box and you play the tight ends in the running game. That gives him the opportunity, and that's really where this offense has to win. And again, we're going to get to some of these thoughts when it comes to the receivers and how important they are, because you can talk about running backs and tight ends and how devastating they can be in the passing game. That's fine. One of the other things they talked about is who's available on the outside, because it's not just in the running game you add into the box. It's also flood the middle of the field where running backs and tight ends are the major threats. And that's where I think when fans are talking about, like, hey, get Nick Singleton in the passing game, get all these guys into the passing game, that's great, but it all happens in the same area. That was the problem last year. Tight ends don't get open the same way as wide receivers who are outside the numbers and have 10 yards either direction laterally to get open. So it has to be Trey Wallace. And then I think some of the point that I'm not necessarily totally bought in on yet is the Omari Evans conversation, because I think he has to be for this to be an optimal offense. But I don't know that's necessarily going to be. I have to see that one first. I've seen enough from Trey Wallace, the individual, in just glimpses of watching him and some of the things he did when he was healthy last season, that I think, okay, there's more evidence there that I see he's going to be able to hold up his end of the bargain in this offense. But it really is the rest of the receiver room. What else is there? Because you can, just like a pass rusher, and I apologize, I'm ranting here now. Just like one pass rusher, you can get that guy out of the play through scheme and design, where you can double team him, you can chip him, whatever. So you need the number 2 and number 3 option to step up. That's going to be, I think, a major story of this offense is we kind of have identified who the 1, 2, and 3 options are at those positions, but the number 2 receiver or the number 2 tight end has to step up in this offense. And if that gives you anxiety, Greg, for Penn State football fans, maybe it stresses you out thinking about the receivers, check out RogueShop.com. They're back for here as we're in training camp. RogueShop.com. They're a husband and wife cannabis store that has been working here with the BWI Live Show for a couple of years now. They are a health and wellness company that is not just trying to get you these cannabis products, but get you the cannabis products that are going to help you with whatever ailments are in your life. This isn't necessarily just about slinging stuff around. It's about products that help with anxiety, stress, chronic pain, or insomnia. So if you need something to help you get over whatever chronic situation you may have, I turn to RogueShop.com. I've talked about it here during the football season. You know, this is a fun job, but it's a high wire act at times when you're balancing 6 different things and trying to be on air and give you concise conversation points and try to do this concisely. You know, you get off and maybe you're here at a 10 and you come down to a 7 after a post-game show. For me, RogueShop.com helps me sleep, not just in the regular season, but also in the off season. Also, each box, when you order from them, comes with a personal handwritten letter from Mrs. Rogue. Nice personal touch. On the website, they give you the live chat function. Somebody's always there to answer your questions, to help you pick out the right products to help you with your situation. So use RogueShop.com. Link is in the description of the video for their products. Glad they're back with us here on the BWI Live Show. So what are we doing next, Greg?
Well, T. Frank, I think it's time to move on to a look back at Media Day and the quotes that have stuck with us throughout the week that's been, well, not really a week, but 5 days or whatever it's been since Penn State Saturday. Media Day, obviously, if you're not aware of that, I will just give you a brief rundown that Penn State gets together. James Franklin, all three coordinators talk at Beaver Stadium. Players and assistant coaches talk after them, and then they talk to, we talk to each other and figure out what we're going to write and then go watch practice. So that's your Media Day rundown. Do you have an intro for this, Steve Frank?
I do. And I apologize to everybody's ears. I'll have that fixed for next week. This is I love this particular part of, I don't want to say it's a game, but like, these coaches are trying to answer questions, and they're trying to do so without giving away any important information, but also let you know kind of the spirit of what's going on. And some of these things, I just think about them throughout the week of, what I've seen and what I know about these schemes from these coordinators, which is why I focused on those guys, and what it means potentially for what we see in a couple of weeks. So that's what I've got. And I know you got a couple of players you talked to that you want to discuss what they had to say too.
Yeah, so let's start with the coordinator side of things. Those guys talk first, so it seems only fitting to start there. First one, stuck with you, T. Frank. Let's dive into it, and we'll start with the running backs, who we talked about just a moment ago. It was Andy Nittany, the first-year Penn State offensive coordinator, who, by the way, if you haven't checked out his video of the full press conference at BlueWhiteIllustrated.com here on the YouTube channel or on the site, certainly do. He is a big presence, I think is probably the best way to put it. It is a very different vibe than what Mike Yurcich had. Not to say either one's right, one's wrong, whatever, but just a very different vibe, very different personality. But T. Frank, you focused in on a part of the running back conversation that includes the top two, but also goes beyond that.
Yeah, and I'm glad I'm going to start there for two reasons. One, the audio clip did not upload for some reason, so I'm vamping here to let it upload. But secondly, you mentioned Andy Nittany as far as like his presence in the room, and I thought it was interesting when like game recognizes game. So he talked about he talked about Nick Dawkins and said like he's a special person. You know them when you meet them, especially guys that are young in their late teens, early 20s who have a presence about them, and went on about Nick Dawkins and his personality and how he's kind of like this beacon of magnetism for everyone around him. Andy Nittany's kind of the same dude. He's a person that's personable, where he interacts with not just, people like him who have similar viewpoints and all those things of people who are in football. It's not just those people he reacts well with. The reason we all like him so far, Greg, is because we all react well with him when we ask questions or when we interact with him, individually. So it is very much like that is a difference in this offense and in this offensive room where you've got a guy that you feel like has that dynamism to him. It just makes you feel more comfortable. Whether or not the schemes work, that's one thing. But like that kind of comfort level, I think, is why everyone's very optimistic about Andy Nittany to start. But here's what he had to say. He was asked about Kaytron Allen and Nick Singleton, and he ended up talking about two other players.
And how does having two kind of number one caliber running backs kind of unlock that creativity for you?
Well, in that room especially, you always want to feel like you got a group of guys that are able to perform at a high level. And, those two names are very obvious. Going in, I'll tell you, Cam Wallace had a really good fall camp. Quentin Martin, showed up in January, and he has been really, really good. Those four guys who have been around, they're developed because I'm bringing up Cam and Q because, those guys have to develop and grow. So you have this really competitive room, but then to those two individually, my challenge to them has been, let's diversify ourselves. Let's figure out ways that you can touch the ball without just having to take a handoff. And I think they've done a really, really good job of that, embracing maybe the mental side of things and the technique side of things that needs to occur.
I find that incredibly illuminating because when asked about Kaytron Allen and Nick Singleton, how do you use those guys? He mentions Quentin Martin and Cam Wallace because if you're going to run two running backs, and this was a big part of the Kansas offense, you need to have insurance because you can't lose like a third of your playbook if one of those guys goes down. So having two guys is great. Having 3, 4 is more essential in this offense. And this was kind of the conversation we had last year about using Katron Allen and Nick Singleton together. It's a great idea, but what if? And that's always the thing you're trying to do as an offensive coordinator or as a head coach is minimize your exposure to risk. And so what that tells me is it's going to be massive. Like the plan for Katron Allen and Nick Singleton is massive if we're talking about needing those younger guys to be ready. Because first off, you want to get them reps, take some reps off them in non-conference games. And secondly, you need to have that depth and insurance purpose. And then that last part, he talks about diversifying. They want all 4 of these running backs to be able to do everything. They want receivers to be able to run. They want running backs able to catch. They want tight ends able to block from any position, run routes down the field. Everyone's got to be diversified in this offense. So it's going to be, it's going to be running back heaven for people that want to see all of that stuff and want to see these guys featured. I think they're going to do that, especially after what Andy Kolnicki said there.
Yeah, there's no question about it, T. Frank. And I think that what's important to remember is that Cam Wallace was one of the buzzier players of spring, just in terms of the things he can do and the way he looks now as he gets ready for his latest season on campus. So exciting things for him, and obviously Quentin Martin. Many are interested to see how Penn State can use him out of the backfield as a true freshman, as a receiver, and what ways Andy Kolnicki can come up with to put his immense talent on the field. So, I think that, ultimately they love that running backs room, and they should. It's the strength of the offense, one of the strengths of the team, and it goes beyond just Nick Singleton and Katron Allen. So I did have a chance to chat with Cam Wallace for a bit. He's certainly looking forward to the season ahead and is very intrigued about the role he will have. So I think that will be one of the more interesting things to figure out between West Virginia and then the following week. And, what does it look like against what should be, on paper at least, the more challenging of the first 2 non-conference games? And then what does it look like in the home opener when Penn State comes back to Beaver Stadium and faces Bowling Green after going to Morgantown? And then what will that tell us about how they're going to use these guys in 2024? So it's a good quote to think about, because I do believe that as we go through preseason camp, and, fortunately, all of you have been here all off season long, but as people who are not as dedicated as you are, to get back into the swing of things with Penn State football, that we're talking about the receivers, it's going to ramp up more and more. And the conversation about how the running backs can be used to mitigate those issues is going to continue. So it's a good quote to keep in mind, because I think it's going to be one that comes up continuously, T. Frank, over the next few weeks.
Do you want to do one? We'll go back and forth.
Yeah, sure. So the one that stuck out to me, and I mentioned it a little bit earlier, but Drew Shelton, on being healthy and the experience he had last year, he said, obviously I'm my own player. I can't be Olu. I can't be Caden. Obviously Olu Fashanu, Caden Wallace is who he's referring to, but I'm going to learn from them, use all the tips that they've given me to make myself the best left tackle for Penn State football. And, the one thing in talking to him that was the last quote I got from him earlier. He said that 2023 was a struggle for him down the stretch. He had the postseason planned surgery, which kept him out for spring ball. He's fully healthy, ready to go here in preseason camp. But clearly 2023 was tough for him from a health perspective. Still played pretty well, especially in the Peach Bowl. I think he had like almost 70, right around 70 snaps in the Peach Bowl, and learned a lot. It's interesting. He's a third-year guy. He's going to be a first-year starting tackle. T. Frank, in terms of first-year starting left tackles, he feels about as least like that as I think you can possibly be, because of how much he's had to play his first 2 years.
So that's
go ahead.
I was going to say, I asked James Franklin about that, of like, here's a guy that has played for you, but we're talking about him as a first-time starter, and I know you've talked about these guys as we view them as starters. Like, what does that mean? And his answer was kind of interesting, of a guy that we've played with previously that allowed us to win a game. So I think that there is a there's a certain level there of understanding that Drew Shelton hasn't been great, and I think that that's something that we have to kind of have that conversation of. He was good for a freshman. They schemed around him. They could win with him in that situation because he does some things that are really good. Like, I think he's going to be a good run blocker in this wide zone system. But his pass protection hasn't been elite in those 2 years. One time he was a freshman coming from a school that didn't pass block, so he was still learning that on the job. And then last year he was injured. You talked about the Peach Bowl. Not a good performance from Drew Shelton. So there is that mystery for us of here he is as a first-time starter, but one with a lot of evidence. And so I do think that there is an interesting dynamic there of everyone knows he's going to be the starter, but I don't think everyone is on the same page about the confidence level in his performance. Penn State, I think, is higher on him than maybe some of the skepticism around him.
Yeah, and I think that's fair, and I think you're right to point out the fact that, again, he he was a true freshman 1 year and then playing through an injury for a large chunk of the second year. So now the question just becomes fully healthy, fully experienced. Is he ready to take on what is obviously one of the most important positions on the field for Penn State? And, by all indications he's ready and up for the challenge. But, just like some of these other positions, you're going to have question marks about it, I think, until you actually see it on the field at West Virginia on August 31st. You can see all the camp clips you want, T. Frank. You can see all of the interviews after practice about this, that, and the other thing. But, I do think that the offensive line, and particularly both tackle spots, are ones where if you have question marks about that going into the game and it's something that worries you ahead of the Lions trip to Morgantown, I can't say I blame you.
That was something they brought up on the BTN show, right? That was something I read of. Just an open question. You're replacing three of the most important positions on the roster for the offensive line: left tackle, center, right tackle. You can feel confident about these guys, but we don't know really about that. And that kind of leads.
Let me ask you this real quick before we move on, T. Frank. What does that say about the progress the Penn State offensive line has made over the last handful of years? Because the receivers were, the group that got talked about like the receivers are this year was always the offensive line.
Oh yeah.
And now
2022 feels like forever ago, right?
Yeah. And now we've reached a point where they're replacing, as you just noted, the left tackle, right tackle, and center. And there's seemingly no concern about it at all, which is incredible, considering where this position group was just a few years ago.
Well, think about the fact that we're talking about 4 players. That wouldn't have happened 3 years ago, where you'd say, you've got some talented players maybe on the roster, but you have an obvious starting 2, and nobody's really pushing those players. James Franklin talked about, and I wrote about Javen Williams earlier this week, and how Javen Williams used this spring to kind of prove trust amongst the coaching staff, to the point that James Franklin brought him up as he's a guy that's earned playing time and left the door open for a competition with Drew Shelton during camp. And I think part of that is he's got to maintain his own truths that there are no starting positions guaranteed, right? So there's always a competition going on. But the fact that Javen Williams is in the conversation is a massive change. Then, hey, it's Drew Shelton, and then look over down that cliff, and that's where the next part of this conversation happens. That doesn't happen. There's, again, still a battle at right tackle between Nolan Rucci and Anthony Donko, who are 2 starting level caliber tackles, pure tackles for the Big Ten. It's a massive difference. Now, those guys don't necessarily have the proven track record, but you have to get your track record at some point. You have to start the journey sometime. Not every team is reloading with veteran players at these positions, and sometimes you've got to have that leap of faith, and I think they've got the right guys that make you reasonably confident that this will be a competent offensive line going forward.
Well, I cut you off before we were about to transition to the next quote that keeps in mind that's coming to mind for us. So where do you want to go next?
We're going to stay with running the football, and James Franklin. So it's funny. You talked about this. There's some details of what was on video, some of the highlights they were showing during the BTN broadcast, right? And then there's some things I've noticed during our little looks into Penn State football practice. And there's always this conversation of don't show any scheme. And then everyone else does. And then James Franklin sometimes can't help himself when talking about some of the things they're going to do.
Drew obviously has been able to lean into Danny, has been able to lean into Andy, but I also think some of the things systematically that we're going to do. And I would say even some of these things we're going to do, you guys are going to look at and say, I don't know if that's something I would imagine Drew doing, but by him doing just enough of it opens up and creates opportunities for other things in our offense and makes us difficult to defend.
So, first off, running the football, that's not a code that you really need to decode all that much. But he's been asked to run the football in the past. That's not something new. That's not something that's noteworthy. So what is it about this offense that you might not expect Drew Aller to do, that they're going to do a little bit of. Again, like these are some thinly veiled conversations about what the running game is going to look like, and this is where I'm interested. I'm just going to say it this way. I believe they're going full Kansas. So watch the Kansas film. We're going to talk about some of these things in the Sunday film study a little bit later, but the quarterbacks are going to be a big part of the running game, and that includes Drew Aller. So kind of like the conversation last year where you can't build two offenses. You can't build an offense for Beau Pribula and one for Drew Aller. They have to be able to operate the same offense and all parts of the playbook, but you can lean on one guy for one part more than the other, but they both have to be viable threats to throw and run on those plays when they're in the game. And he brought up Beau Pribula when talking about Andy Kotelnicki's offense and some of the explosive plays. And so, like, I'm trying really hard not to talk in detail about these scheme things, but everyone else seems to be doing it, Greg.
Yeah, so it's certainly one of those things where I think you hit the nail right on the head. Sometimes these guys get excited, they can't help themselves. But ultimately, to the point you made a minute ago, I mean, it is going to be, they may have, as Andy Kotelnicki has kind of said, and James Franklin has talked about, they sort of merged and blended Andy Kotelnicki's offense with the traditional Penn State offense, and they tried to find the best way to blend those two together. Again, will it work? We're going to find out here soon enough. Is hope high that it's going to work? Yes, of course. But it's not lost on me that James Franklin has said a couple of times now over the last couple of months that when you first watch the tape, you think more of Beau than Drew, and of course you do when you watch the Kansas tape. So why that keeps coming up, I don't know. But Pribula is going to have a role this year. There's no doubt about that. I think that goes back to kind of the whole conversation about using your best players in maximizing their potential and finding ways to get guys who can change the game on the field. And we heard endlessly, T. Frank, about the Beau Pribula package last year, and then game day would come, and it wasn't around. It wasn't used. It was undelivered. So return to sender. So I don't think that's going to be the case this time around. Yeah. And the more you hear these guys talk throughout the preseason, I think the more evident that becomes.
Yeah, and it's a part of. This has been my biggest question, and this has been the situation that Andy Kotelnicki has been handed of. How do you build an offense around this particular group of players? And he's committed to building an offense that puts his talent each year in position to succeed, which is why I went all the way back to Wisconsin Whitewater to see what he's used to accentuate different styles of offense. And there are different offenses in his history that don't run the quarterback as much. But you have these elements. And James Franklin, going all the way back to what he said about why he hired Andy Kotelnicki, was we were using similar formations and plays, and he was getting more explosive plays out of those talent pools than we were. So that's why we've chosen him to be this guy. But it all doesn't fit perfectly. And to me, that's how he tightens that nut down on this particular sports car is going to determine how successful it is. And with what James Franklin is saying and with what Andy Kotelnicki is saying, it's going to be run-based. But how much of those things, I think, is just the determining factor. And then does Drew pull it off is the final piece. In this unlocks the passing game. Like, that's what I'm also, the important thing is all of this of why they stack practice the way they do, what we started to begin with, is it all unlocks a simpler, more direct passing attack that doesn't ask the quarterback to be Peyton Manning on every play like maybe they did in the past.
Right, and there's no doubt about that. Speaking of the past, one thing that did not take place in the past, T. Frank, that will take place now in the present and in the future is the NFL style of communication on game day.
Yeah.
So Penn State coaches will be able to communicate on offense and defense with a player on the field. Obviously, on the defensive side of the ball, we would expect Tom Allen to be communicating with the middle linebacker, Kobe King, in most instances. Obviously, on the offensive side of the ball, Andy Kotelnicki will be talking to the quarterback, Drew Aller. So it's a big change this year. It's new to 2024. The rules of college football also include a ability to watch video on the sideline with iPads, which is new this year. So those are two technology changes that if you have not heard about them, you're going to hear a lot about them, including, I believe, T. Frank, what Tom Allen had to say on the topic.
Yeah, so the green dot on defense is a little less straightforward than on offense. As you mentioned, like the quarterback And somebody asked who's going to be wearing it, and I think that was kind of like a functional part of the question of like just got to get that fact on camera. But on defense, there's a real question of who's going to wear it on third down. And Tom Allen talked about how they planned and how they have been using the green dot. I wanted to know this particular conversation point. I asked James Franklin about it all the way back in the spring, and he punted on the conversation because they didn't have enough of the helmets to really go through like a full practice and figure it out. But they've since then had the opportunity, and now they're in camp. They have those helmets. Here is how Tom Allen said they're going to use them during the season.
I think the green dot, and how we utilize it, it's going to be a lot. It's going to be dependent upon the offensive style and tempo and what they choose to do with the green dot. Do they huddle? Do they not? Do they use to do different mechanisms to maximize things? And so definitely, so what we're in the process of doing right now is to be able to have multiple ways of getting our calls into the defense, but the green dot is a constant.
So that's going to be, he almost gave me what I wanted, and then he said at the very end, and the green dot is going to be a constant. So on third down, last year, Penn State, until they went back to some base formations, when they were in their prowler package on third down with Manny Diaz, the Mike linebacker came off the field. So Kobe King, not the elite coverage player in those situations, he came off the field, and they would have, Abdul Carr, they would put on 6 defensive backs and 4 defensive ends and like minimize the linebackers on the field. But if he's got the dot, who's coming in on third down, or does he stay on the field on third down? And if they have multiple ways to get the signals into the defense, then I think it makes it less critical that your middle linebacker is on the field at all times. They're not going to jump in and go completely all helmet communication. They're still going to have the guys on the sidelines holding up the posters and putting in the signs and doing all this stuff. So it makes it a little bit less of an important question, but it still has the question of you want that helmet out there on third down, especially because that's when offenses are going to use their most advanced passing attacks to then try and get an open play. And you need to have that communication, a pre-snap of what you're seeing and how you're seeing it if you're the defense coordinator. So how do you get that information in if your middle linebacker isn't on the field? It's still an open question, but I do think that I was assuming Kobe had to be on the field 100% of the time. I'm less inclined to that now. So this one less definitive than some of the other ones, but also I think an important conversation we should have before we get to the first game because it's going to determine some of those third down decisions.
Yeah, there's no doubt. I think the other thing too, and Tom Allen kind of said it, kind of didn't, and you mentioned it earlier in the show, but certainly on offense, there's a lot more importance to this than there is defensively. I mean, you hear about this all the time in the NFL with the quarterback and the things that they can change because of what they hear in the helmet. You hear about it sometimes with the defense, but not nearly as much as you do with the offense. So a nice thing to have, but I think for the defense, especially with Tom Allen being on the sideline, Frank, I think the iPads are going to be much more valuable to the defense than the in-helmet communication.
Oh, yeah.
Not to say they're not. It's not to say that they're one's going to be terrible and one's going to be great, but I do think on the scale of importance, the iPads probably do more for this defense on a play-to-play and series-to-series basis than the in-helmet communication does. Where for the other side of the ball, I say it's probably the opposite.
Yeah, so understanding what the offense is trying to do on every play, that's how in-game adjustments happen. And if you're trying to explain it instead of visually showing somebody, hey, this is where the routes are coming from, this is how they've augmented this play, this is what we were expecting, this is what they're doing, if you can visually show that, it's easier to make those in-game adjustments, especially with young players. Bane Train says this. He says, I think at this point, with technology being where it is, I'd like all players to get coach calls from the sideline. Maybe the technology isn't there, but this keep the whole team more involved. A radio in every helmet, Greg. I don't know the technology of that either. There have been instances, mysteriously over the years, where opposing radio calls in the NFL suddenly don't work at NFL games. So I don't know whether that's home cooking or that is actually too many radio signals can interfere. I legitimately don't know the differences there. I think that would be a little overkill. I think you still need to have that on-field communication between players. But Bane Train brings up a good point. I have wireless speakers all over my house. Why can't you put a wireless speaker in all of the helmets? You had another one from Caden Saunders that's a special teams conversation. So what did he say that you thought was interesting?
Yeah, so I had the chance to talk to Caden Saunders after Justin Lustig. It may be the most definitive statement in a Penn State Media Day history in terms of the outcome of a position battle. He said that Caden Saunders is the leader in the clubhouse to return to the punt return role. I don't think that surprises anyone, certainly not if you've been following our reporting over at BlueWhiteIllustrated.com. But usually, as you mentioned earlier, T. Frank, the conversation at Media Day is about, this idea of endless competition and no jobs are ever won and lost this early in camp, blah, blah, blah. Well, punt returner seems to be pretty well decided. So Caden Saunders, speaking about the opportunity ahead of him, assuming he wins that job at Penn State Media Day, said, "I'm taking a lot of pride this year in showing people that I can do what Daquan Hardy was doing plus more. That's something I take pride in." And he would later go on to say that he felt at times last year he was sort of tiptoeing and was tentative once he caught the ball. I don't think there's any question about that. I think we all saw that with our own two eyes, which is why Penn State moved on to Daquan Hardy. But I also don't doubt Saunders' ability to be able to change the game as a punt returner. And most importantly, and again, I feel like he's found himself and we found ourselves in this place where just because Daquan Hardy had 2 punt return touchdowns, that Caden Saunders immediately is not cut out for this job. But he catches the ball, and that is rule number 1. If he catch the ball and don't not catch it and then let it roll 20 yards are the 2 main factors of punt returner. And if you are able to get a good return out of it, awesome. And if you are able to be explosive, awesome. And is he going to be able to be more explosive for Penn State this year than he was last year? He thinks he can be. Now, of course, what's he going to say? No. So there's that side of it as well. But I do think that, I do think listening to him talk, looking at him, watching him do some things in both spring practice and in preseason camp so far, I do think there's a chance for him. I'm not sure he's going to run the same speed Daquan Hardy does. Few people do. But I do think there's a chance for him in a role that he's now more comfortable with and more familiar with, to turn in some of those explosive plays that Penn State was missing when he was the primary punt returner early last year. But then also, again, just simply the fact that even if they don't get all of those, the key here, of course, is to make sure you don't lose field position. And if you gain it, great, but don't lose any more than you have to. And Saunders is very good at that.
That's just one of those situations where he's a player that would benefit exponentially from confidence. Confidence in his offensive play and confidence on special teams. And it's been something I think you can almost visually see that indecision. And like he talked about, like wanting to show people those things and that motivation. I just think he's an interesting player because I expect a big step from him. I think confidence is a really funny thing where once you have it, it can snowball and then it's not a problem. But the minute that waiver gets into your head, it can take a long time to recover from if you're a football player who, they're out there putting it all on the line, completely at the mercy and judgment of everybody. Just from everyone's watching you. Sometimes guys don't rise to that occasion right away. I think Caden Saunders, what I'm hearing in this conversation about special teams is just if he's confident this year, offense and special teams, he's going to provide them with an asset in those areas.
Yeah, there's no question about it. And I do think that of that redshirt sophomore group, he's the one to keep an eye on to potentially find a bigger role in the depth chart in 2024 in a receivers room where obviously, as we've talked at length, ad nauseum, there are plenty of opportunities available for snaps if you can earn them. T. Frank, I believe that covers everything we wanted to cover in this segment. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah. We can skip the conversation about defensive tackles because we've gone on this topic for about 20 minutes now. But just to quickly wrap up, what I was going to highlight here is there's been a conversation. Tom Allen he's talked about this multiple times now. Very excited about the defensive tackles when we talk about the defensive line, and everyone wants to know about Abdul Carter. He's like, yeah, but have you seen these defensive tackles? And he said they're going to be athletic. We're not a defense that sits back. So to me, that gives me the indication Penn State's going to retain a little bit of the Manny Diaz flair for Tom Allen of moving guys around and not using kind of static positions and alignments from the defensive tackles, because that was a hallmark of what this defense did so well against the run, of not just being bigger and stronger, but also more athletic because you're jumping a gap on every single play. Maybe it's not all the way there, but that's going to be a part of the flavor of this defense for sure.
Yeah, no question about it. Well, I believe it's time to get into our last segment of the day, unless we get into mailbag questions before we wrap up late. But T. Frank has been busy over at BlueWhiteIllustrated.com studying Andy Kotelnicki's past to be able to tell you what it means for the Penn State offense in the present. T. Frank, your latest Sunday film study broke down. Now my rundown doesn't want to load. There we go. Kansas, West Virginia, 2022. Yeah. So a very fitting contest to watch, considering Andy Kotelnicki, of course, comes from Kansas, and Penn State will face a Neil Brown-led West Virginia for the second time in 2 years, the first time in Morgantown, just a few weeks from now on August 31st. So what'd you learn?
Yeah, so if you want to go see, I break all these down, and I do video cut-ups if I can find some video to share with you guys on the Blue White Illustrated message board. So we're going to do some high-level takeaways, but if you want to get into the details and kind of the nitty-gritty of everything we've talked about in the show so far, this, from my perspective, all the things I brought up from the beginning of the show to the points that Andy Kotelnicki made that I find are interesting, it all leads up to this of how is the offense going to function. And I keep coming back to it's going to be more Kansas than I expected. So going back to how they attacked West Virginia, some of the comparisons to 2023 with Penn State's offense and some of the different styles of attack, this particular game, they didn't put up 55 points because I think the defense scored an interception touchdown, but they put up in the 40s in this game. So a really impressive run game-led attack. And that's really kind of coming back to some of the things we've talked about. This offense, spoke to Drew Aller about this, Andy Kotelnicki, Javen Williams, talked to all of these important people about the offense. And the offense is designed to make things easier on the offensive line and the quarterback. And what all this stuff does is it messes with the box. So the box, for those that don't know, is the imaginary line where you start at the offensive tackles inward and about 7 yards, 8 yards deep, where the running back would be and then where the linebackers would be. How many players are there and how many players are not there based on how your offense puts the defense in conflict? And that's where these motions and shifts come in. And not only that, there's this, and I really want you to go see this because I equate it to Manny Diaz's defense. When you look at Andy Kotelnicki's schemes, there's almost something artistic about them where you've got guys pulling this way and you've got guys pulling this way, and it creates this shearing effect in the defense where they've got conflicting rules of literally, I'm supposed to be running both ways at the same time. So what do I believe? What do I read? And how do I react? And what that does is not only can it lighten the box load, it can make the angles for the offensive line easier where everything's less static, so linebackers can't come downhill as quickly. And so that's kind of the fundamental part of this offense. At any point in Andy Kotelnicki's career has been this distortion of using wide zone techniques, pulling, and attacking laterally with the run game, paired with some of these blurring of the lines of the passing game and the run game. And it created, Greg, a very simple passing game. You look at some of these drop back passes. Jalen Daniels is actually a better quarterback than I expected, but he wasn't making a lot of hard reads. He wasn't making a lot of difficult decisions because the run game opened up a lot of stuff in the play action game, and then the straight drop backs had so many other similar characteristics to those run actions that it created some stress in the defense. And this particular defense is very reactionary, where they have an extra safety. They only play with 3 defensive linemen a lot of times. They like to drop 8. So those players are now running all over the field the wrong direction, creating big windows or a very light box to run against. And I think that's kind of the high level, what did they do from that game? And I would expect to see something similar from him this time around with Penn State, with admittedly better players in a similar situation where 2022 was really the first time they had a chance to install that offense fully. The year before, he didn't get there until May. So I kind of look at 2022 as the first year they are doing a lot of these things. And I think that is a similar correlation to the advanced timeline they've tried to put everything on with this offense installing it the way they have.
Does this make Drew Aller's life easier, and does it make it less necessary for him to make the word's not harder decisions, but the riskier decisions? Does this make his life easier, and does this help solve the problem that we saw a year ago of maybe you could throw it into a tight window and get 20 yards, or you could throw an interception, so instead just dump it off and take 2 and go back to the huddle? Do you think some of this stuff that happens here makes those, even if they are dump offs or short throws, intermediate throws, does that change the calculus for him a bit and maybe play to his style better, even though we still, I think, all agree that no more risk are needed in 2024?
Yeah, no, he still needs to be more aggressive, because even in this game, there were throws that were like back shoulder or into tight windows or places where it's not wide open. Not every single one of these plays. Jalen Daniels had a really good throw to the back shoulder to a receiver for like 40 yards, and it wasn't open. And the read said it wasn't open because of the way the defensive back played that, but it was one-on-one. So you trusted that guy to go up and get the football, and you threw it in a spot where he could go get it. So that still has to happen. And even looking at some of the stuff from 2023 when Jason Bean was the starter, the windows are there, but you have to throw with pace into those windows downfield. There, you can't really eliminate all the risk for the quarterback. You can only give them as good of an opportunity as you can make it. And then again, it comes back to the receivers needing to be able to get open, and why he talked about, and we played that clip yesterday on yesterday's show, physicality through routes to make sure that you're where you're supposed to be, and give the quarterback that level of trust to throw you the football. Trust is a two-way street. We talked about this last year of not necessarily seeing it or not knowing that a guy was going to be open, and going past his first read. It's not just that the receivers have to trust the quarterback. It's the quarterback has to trust the receivers, because, yeah, you're going to get passed up for some deep routes and maybe you don't run as hard the next time. But if the quarterback trusts you, he's going to throw you the football more often. I think that has to be established in this offense.
And that will be what Andy Kotelnicki and Drew Aller and the rest of this Penn State offense look for as they continue preseason camp. Certainly we saw some of it during spring practice, but the time is ticking. There's only so much time. I think it was one of the coordinators said on the BTN show that, West Virginia, the phasing in of West Virginia prep starts in about a week. So, Penn State fully focusing on itself right now. But before long, it's going to be time to they're going to start to blend, and then it's going to lean towards West Virginia prep. So, we're not that far away from that being the case. So, T-Frank, any final thoughts on your Sunday film study? Again, you can check that out at bluewhiteillustrated.com. One thing I note from your look here in the rundown is that tight ends and running backs were heavily involved, but they were not necessarily where the ball always ended up.
So that is, it's so fascinating, because I try to eliminate perception bias as much as I possibly can, of letting my emotions be dictated by big plays, of what, look at the whole forest, don't look at the trees. And I came out of this game going, okay, so they dominated with tight ends and running backs throwing over the middle, because they got two walk-in touchdowns to a running back and to a tight end over the middle. But if you look at the snap distribution of passes, the receivers got 9 targets. So they only threw the ball 18 times. 50% of the targets or more went to the receivers. I apologize. 9 of 18 targets went to the wide receivers. So you still need to have 3 receivers on the field to create this balance that allows the running game to be aggressive. It does not work if you just have Quentin Martin out in the slot. It does not work if Nick Singleton or Katron Allen is in the slot. You can't have 2 tight ends and have a balanced attack if the receivers aren't getting open. So all of this stuff is possible, and you can be devastating in this offense with tight ends, with play action. But going back to what they said on the tailgate show, or the training camp show from BTN, those threats outside have to show up. So there has to be some semblance of balance. And I keep wanting to nail this home for Penn State fans. Is yes, it's going to be, like we said on the thumbnail, running back heaven. You're going to see a lot of running backs involved. If you don't have a receiver or more, then there's still going to be problems. This offense, to me, devolves quickly into a triple option offense, which is in its core a limited concept that you're using because your passing game doesn't work. So it's kind of built to withstand those problems, but fundamentally you still have those problems and you're overcoming them, and that's not a balanced team.
No, and that is certainly what Penn State was not for much of the 2023 season, and what it hopes to overcome and become in 2024 with Andy Kotelnicki. That's part of the reason he's here. That's part of the reason Julian Fleming came aboard.
Yep.
We can talk endlessly about the receivers, T. Frank, but ultimately, we've been down that road so many times. We have a couple more weeks to continue going down that road, but that is where we're at this point. I think we're coming down the home stretch here of the BWI Live Show for Wednesday, August 7th. I think you covered everything you're hoping to with that. So any final thoughts as we wrap up here? Look forward to seeing everyone back on Thursday for, I believe, a recruiting show or some kind of show tomorrow. There will also be, of course, our insight and intel from practice later this week. T. Frank, final thoughts as we roll into week number 2 of training camp.
I want to know, you mentioned the West Virginia prep. The thing I'm interested in is what happens once they start getting into West Virginia prep. What we've seen in the past is they have to work on some things in front of us when it's game week. What does that look like with Andy Kotelnicki? Have they changed that approach? How does all of this fit together from what we outlined here in the show and what we've seen so far from them? Because you're right, when you're working on yourself, you can work on whatever you want, but at a certain point, you have to say, okay, we've mastered that stuff, or we have to have mastered that. Now we need to apply this to our opponent, and how exactly we're going to do that. That'll give me a little more insight if they start doing that in the next week or so. But they also could just keep doing what they're doing, and we'll never see the quarterbacks throw a pass, and then our YouTube highlights are less interesting when Drew Eller isn't slinging the ball 40 yards down the field. So that's what I'm looking for in the next couple of weeks.
All right, well, stay tuned to BlueWhiteIllustrated.com. T. Frank, can we hit them with that promo code one more time? If you sign up to BlueWhiteIllustrated.com, you're not going to find a better offer than this. $1 for 2 months. Use code PSU1. That is code PSU1 at BlueWhiteIllustrated.com. $1 for 2 months of access to insider intel, premium recruiting, and team news, T. Frank's film breakdowns, and so much more. We'll have more of that this week. We'll be back here on the YouTube channel and the podcast feed. So for Thomas Frank Carr, I'm Greg Pickel. We will catch you next time on BWI Live. Thanks for being with us.